Some scientific studies, they really cross a line. But what happens when an experiment is so disturbing that the researchers' own colleagues give it a terrible nickname? Well, that's what we're talking about today. This is the story of the monster study. So that really gets you thinking, right? What exactly turns an experiment into a monster? We're going to dig into that by looking at a study that just blew past every ethical line imaginable. It really makes you wonder, in the search for knowledge, where do we draw the line? All right, let's go back in time. We're in 1939 at an orphanage in Iowa. And what happened there? It was a psychology experiment so shocking, both in what they did and the damage it caused, that the researchers at the very same university started calling it the monster study. I mean, could you imagine? That name came from its own peers. So, what was this all for? What were they even trying to figure out? Well, it all came from one man, a researcher named Wendell Johnson. And he had this pretty controversial theory about what causes kids to stutter, and he was absolutely determined to prove it. Okay, so here was Johnson's big idea. He thought stuttering wasn't a physical thing, not something you're born with. Instead, he believed it was a learned behavior. His theory was that if you take a kid who has normal little speech hesitations, like all kids do, and you label it, you call it a stutter, then the anxiety from that label alone could actually cause them to start stuttering for real. So to test this whole thing out, Johnson and his grad student, Mary Tudor, came up with a few key questions. They wanted to see if positive feedback helped or if negative feedback made things worse, but it was that last question that is truly chilling. They literally asked, can we make a perfectly fluent child develop a stutter just by telling them they have one? And right there, that's where we get to the massive, fundamental ethical problem with this whole experiment. To get their answers, they specifically chose to test their theory on a group of kids who were completely defenseless, children with no parents to protect them, and absolutely no way to say no. Their test subjects were 22 children living in an orphanage. They were as young as 5 and as old as 16. I mean, these kids were about as vulnerable as you can get, and that vulnerability was exactly what the researchers exploited for their study. The way they set it up was just so calculated and totally deceptive. They screened more than 250 children to pick out the 22 they wanted. And here's the kicker. They lied. They told the orphanage staff and the kids that this was all just speech therapy. They never once mentioned it was an experiment. Okay, so look at how they broke this down. It's just so cold. They took kids who already stuttered and split them up. One group got praise, the other got criticism. Then they had a group of kids who spoke perfectly fine, and they praised them. But that last group, Group 2A, this is the heart of the tragedy. These were perfectly fluent children who were told over and over again that they were starting to stutter. So the big question is, what happened? What was the impact on those kids in Group BA, the ones who were told they stuttered? Well, the results were immediate and just heartbreaking. It showed the very real, very damaging consequences of what they were doing. I mean, the change was just night and day. These were kids who were confident, who had no problem speaking up, but after weeks of being told their speech was flawed, they just shut down. They got anxious, they got quiet. Some of them completely stopped talking or reciting in class. The psychological toll was immediate and obvious. And this wasn't just some phase that passed when the experiment was over. No way. For some of these children, that anxiety, that emotional damage, it stuck with them for the rest of their lives. A fear of speaking that they carried all the way into adulthood. Even the person running the sessions, Mary Tudor, saw what she had done. Apparently, she was racked with guilt. She actually went back to the orphanage and tried to reverse the damage, using positive feedback this time. But she herself admitted that for some of the kids, it was too late. The harm was done, and it couldn't be undone. So after all this, you'd think it would become a famous or infamous case study, right? Nope. For decades, this whole thing was kept under wraps. Wendell Johnson never even published the results. But, a secret this dark, it can't stay buried forever, even if it takes over half a century to surface. And when I say a long time, I mean it. The study was done in 1939. It wasn't until 2001, think about that, 62 years later, that a journalist finally brought the whole story to light. And even then, it took another 6 years for the survivors to see any kind of justice. Finally, in 2007, the state of Iowa reached a settlement with 7 of the survivors, $925,000. That was the price tag put on a lifetime of psychological and emotional harm that started when they were just kids in an orphanage. And once the story was out, the University of Iowa, the institution behind the research, had to face the music. They put out a public apology, calling the whole experiment regrettable. As you can imagine, a lot of people felt that regrettable was, well, a pretty big understatement. So why does a study from 1939 still matter so much today? Because the monster study, as tragic as it was, ended up being this incredibly powerful cautionary tale. It's one of the key reasons that the rules for how we conduct scientific research changed forever. Its biggest legacy really boils down to two words: informed consent. This is a huge deal in research now. It's the simple, critical idea that you can't just experiment on people. They have to be told everything, especially the risks, and they have to willingly agree to participate. And that is exactly the rule the monster study completely ignored. And the result of all this? Today, we have really strict laws and ethical codes designed to make sure something like the monster study can never, ever happen again. These rules exist because of terrible experiments like this one. They're like a firewall, built to protect people, especially children, from being harmed in the name of science. So this all brings us right back to where we started. What turns an experiment into a monster? The monster study gives us a pretty clear and pretty horrifying answer. It's a permanent reminder that the search for knowledge, no matter how important it seems, can never, ever come at the cost of someone's well-being. It really leaves us with a heavy question to think about. How do we make sure our own curiosity never crosses that line and becomes monstrous?